We preached about looking to the cross, and we looked at Jesus' life from months before he went to the cross, as he began to tell his disciples that he was going to the cross, and we began to look at much of that. But today we're going to really look at the cross, and we're going to begin in Hebrews chapter 12. I'll give Cody an opportunity to get caught up with me there for just a second before I read this passage of Scripture. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, it says this: "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes upon Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." Let me again state that our attention needs to be upon Jesus Christ. That is what this passage is encouraging us to do, to focus our very lives upon Jesus. Much of what Shalom has shared this morning, we need to take notice of how he endured the cross so that we may be able to endure the hardships that come in our life, that we can be encouraged by Jesus' actions to move forward. We saw last week how Jesus at the Last Supper presented himself as the Passover, at the Passover meal. He presented himself as the Lamb of God who came to take away the sin of the world and to establish a new covenant. He said, "This is my blood, the blood of a new covenant." We recognize as well the anguish that Jesus dealt with in Gethsemane as the weight of sin began to be pressed down upon him, as he began to realize the guilt of sin that you and we recognize in our life at times on a regular basis. But Jesus had never known that guilt because he was sinless. And as well, I believe in the garden, he began to recognize the separation that was taking place between him and the Father as our sin was laid upon him. And then we saw the incredible events of his arrest as he surrendered himself. They came out with clubs and swords and were ready to go have a fight, and Jesus easily surrendered. Though even with his words, "I am he struck them down." Remember reading that. He struck them down by the power of his word, yet he surrendered himself easily. We saw the boldness of Judas, who betrayed him with a kiss. We talked about the courage or the loyalty of Peter as he drew out his sword to defend his master. Jesus told him to put that away, and even after Peter had struck off the ear of that servant, Jesus reached down, picked that ear up, and even in such a moment as he was in, poured out his love and kindness as he healed the man's ears. And that's kind of where we pick up the story this morning. His disciples had fled. Jesus has been arrested. And now he is moving toward the cross in a very quick way. As we look at the verses this morning and look at my message today, I want you to understand that I've tried to take all the verses, all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, talk about the arrest and the cross and the resurrection, but each of them adds a little bit different look at this thing. Imagine, if you would, with me, that you're in a city environment, and you're at a four-way intersection, and there's an accident out in the middle of the intersection. Whatever it may be, a car runs a light, somebody T-bones them, whatever it may be. But not only you are standing at one of the corners witnessing this, there's three people standing at the other three corners. So when the police arrive and they begin to gather reports, they go to each one of the individual witnesses at the four corners. The story will all be the same, but told each each one from a little bit of a different perspective, from seeing in a different angle, different personalities, seeing different things. It's amazing how especially, now I'm not trying to pick on either side, but especially men and women can watch and see the same thing. And a woman sees it very differently than a man, because women are made up so much differently than men. It amazes me when I see that. They see this and I see this, and I'm going, how did you see that? And they look at me and they're going, you're a weirdo. You know that? You saw that? But that's how it's, because we're different and we see things. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell the story. Matthew and John were definitely there. Mark quite likely was there. And Luke was the only one who was not there, who gathered stories from everybody, but they all told it from a different perspective. So what I tried to do in preparing for this message, and I, just to be honest, probably spent more time preparing this message than any message I've ever prepared in my life. I literally worked nearly all day long yesterday. I mean, from the time I got up almost to the time I went to bed, I worked. And I'm not saying it to brag, I'm just saying, I just kept looking at things, but I'm trying to put these together, okay, so this is what Peter saw, or Mark, and I put them all together and try to put it in order. And so we're going to try to tell this story from the arrest up until the point of his burial today, try to put it in an order, and hopefully you'll grasp it. I have a better understanding of the cross today than I did a week ago. So let's begin, number one, with the trials. The trials. And what I mean by that is not the testing. I'm talking about where Jesus was literally in a sort of a courtroom setting. Well, there were more than one trial that Jesus went through. So the first one was at Annas' house. At Annas' house. And I've got the scriptures. If you're taking notes and you want to write this down, this might help you to be able to know the order of how things happen, because some of it's a little bit confusing until you really study it to see how the order works out. But Caiaphas was the ruling high priest during the time when Jesus was arrested. But as I told you last week, the high priest was more of a political position during the rule of Rome over Israel than it was a spiritual position. In fact, the Romans appointed the high priests. They weren't elected. They weren't put in place by the Jewish leadership. Rome appointed the high priest. Well, the reality was Annas, who was Caiaphas' father-in-law, Annas, the name I have up there, had been high priest. After him, he had 5 sons, 1 son-in-law, and that's Caiaphas, and 1 grandson that all served in high priest after him. Now think about that. He had been high priest, but the Romans took him out of power because they didn't want him to have too much power, but he got one of his sons in, and then he got another son in, and then another son in. All 5 sons, his son-in-law, and his grandson all served after him. So what does that tell you? That tells you, though Caiaphas was the official high priest, Annas was the guy behind the scenes who was pushing the buttons and pulling the strings. You understand what I'm saying? So when they arrest Jesus, they don't go to Caiaphas' house first to have this trial. They go to Annas' house, the former high priest, but who everybody sees with the power. And so they bring it there, and now Annas is ruling over this thing. So Jesus is brought into his house, and he would have been very wealthy and had a courtyard where people could meet. And Jesus is brought before this kangaroo court, I'm going to call it, a trial that was held very late in the night. Jesus was arrested probably late in the evening, early in the night, depending on your definition of that. Probably 9, 10, 11 o'clock in the evening, Jesus was arrested. He's taken to Annas' house, and he's put before the Sanhedrin, before this group of people who are leaders in Israel, and they're going to decide his fate. And during this time, they bring forth witnesses who begin to make accusations against Jesus. Now, Jewish law said that anything would be confirmed upon 2 or 3 witnesses. That's in the Old Testament law. In other words, if you were accused of something, the only way they could punish you is if there were at least 2 or 3 witnesses who could confirm that you had did what you'd been accused of. So that's what they were doing. They were bringing these witnesses forward, and they could not get a consensus out of hardly any of them. I want to read you some verses, Matthew chapter 26, and you'll see this explained a little bit. Verse 57, so those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest. Now, Matthew says they led him to Caiaphas, but if you read in John's gospel, John says it was at Annas' house. So maybe Caiaphas was the guy who was leading the thing in front, but Annas was standing behind him telling him, now do this, now do this. You get what I'm saying there? You understand? So it was at Annas' house, but Caiaphas was supposedly the guy in charge. So they seized him, led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. But they did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, 2 came forward and stated the same thing and said the same thing. This man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And Jesus had said that. But he wasn't talking about the physical stone brick temple. He was talking about the temple of his body. I'm able to destroy it and raise it again in 3 days. But they had heard Jesus said that. Finally, 2 people agreed on something that Jesus had said or done. Verse 62, the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, you have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, you and I don't recognize those words. Those are out of the Old Testament. And what Jesus just said was, you said it, well, I'm going to tell you, I am the Messiah. That's what he meant by exactly that. I am what you just said. Verse 65, then the high priest tore his robes and said, now the tearing of the robe was a sign of judgment. It's the weirdest thing in the world to me, but that was Jewish custom, that when you made a judgment, you tore a piece of your robe. Now whether they mended it later, I don't know. Maybe a high priest had tears all over his robes from all the judgments he made. I really don't know, but I do know that that's said many times in Scripture. It was a sign of judgment. It was a sign. It was like today we would put the gavel down. I make this judgment. Boom, boom, boom. They tore their robes. So the high priest tore his robes and said, he has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they answered, he deserves death. Then they spat in his face and beat him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is the one who hit you? Quite an ordeal that Jesus goes on in this first trial. It was also during this time that Peter makes his denial of Jesus 3 times. And we're not going to go into that. I will share this one point that I had never caught before, and I challenge you to go and read it. Every time that someone accuses Peter of knowing Jesus, they say it like this: you're one of his disciples too, aren't you? Aren't you one of his disciples also? Now, why did they say that? Because we know that John was also there, but they weren't bothering John, and no one was really trying to bother Peter. They were just saying, aren't you one of his followers? And Peter was so afraid every time Peter said, no, no, I don't know that man. I've never seen him before. Not me, But we're not going to go into all that. We're not going to read about all that. You can go back and study this. So, though it's not stated succinctly, after this, they've accused Jesus. They've decided he needs to die. There's apparently a breaking up of this meeting, this group of men, and they go to their homes and they rest for a few hours. It may be midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. We're not really sure what time it was, but late in the night, and they break up and they go away. Jesus is kept in custody, probably put in a very dank, dark, uncomfortable cell of some sort. But the next morning early, they then go not to Annas' house, they all meet again, this time at Caiaphas' house to make it official. And here they begin a plan of action, what they're going to do, and what they decide is that they're going to take Jesus before Pilate and gain permission to crucify him. They couldn't do it because they were under Roman rule. They did not have the authority to kill him, to punish Jesus with death. But they could gain that approval from Pilate, who was the governor of Judea. And so that's what they did. So they take Jesus to Pilate in order to have him crucified. So we move on from Caiaphas' house to Pilate's palace, to Pilate's big place where he lives, and he has military there and all these types of things. It's called the Praetorium. And so Jesus makes two appearances to Pilate, and this that we're about to read is at his first appearance before Pilate. In Luke chapter 23, it says, "Then the whole body of them," talking about these Jewish leaders, "got up and brought Jesus before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We have found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar.'" None of these things did Jesus do. "And saying that he himself is Christ, a king." So Pilate asked Jesus, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered him and said, "It is as you say." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." Now, in the other Gospels, there's more questioning, more conversation. But eventually, Pilate comes back to the priests and says, I don't find an issue here. You may not like the guy, but I don't find anything worthy of death in this man. Verse 5, "But they kept on insisting, saying, 'He stirs up the people, teaching them all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place.' When Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean, and Jesus was. He was from Nazareth of Galilee. And when Pilate learned that Jesus belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, now this is another leader. Pilate is over Judea, but Herod was the one who was governor over Galilee. So when he learned that Jesus belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself was in Jerusalem at that time. Now this is Herod Antipas. This is son of Herod the Great. And Herod Antipas, he rules in Galilee, and he was a Jewish man, at least part Jewish. He didn't really practice very much, but he was in Jerusalem for the Passover. Pilate knows it, and so he finds a way to get out from underneath this squeamish issue. He says, I'll just send Jesus to Herod and let Herod deal with this issue. So Jesus and this tribunal of accusers head off to Herod's palace. And that's where we go next. Herod's palace in Luke chapter 23 and verse 8. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. He'd heard about Jesus healing the sick and the crippled and the blind and all these things. He said, man, bring him in. Man, I want to get some entertainment here. I want to put on a show. And Herod questioned Jesus at some length. But Jesus answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there, accusing him vehemently. So they're standing there yelling, he's done this and he's done this. And you can just hear the commotion going on. And Jesus is standing there, hands tied probably some way, not saying a word. And Herod with his soldiers, after treating Jesus with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe, a royal robe, in other words, and sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before this they had been enemies with each other. So Jesus actually brought Herod and Pilate together in a strange way. So Luke is the only one that tells us about this trial, this interview before Herod. None of the others mentioned it, but it's a key thing to see there, because we find there that this is the place that I believe where Jesus got the purple robe, the gorgeous robe that he is mocked with throughout. We're going to read on where he's mocked again and again. It came from Herod's palace as Herod makes fun of him and puts this robe upon him. But no decision is made, no pronouncement is made, because Herod sees exactly what Pilate saw, that this was a bunch of jealous Jews who wanted to get this guy, Jesus, out of the way, and it was nothing more than that. So he sends Jesus back to Pilate. So we go to Pilate's second trial or Jesus' second trial before Pilate. And we're going to read on in Luke's Gospel, chapter 23, verse 13. So Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us. And behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore I will punish him." Some punishment, not death, but punishment, and release him. Now Pilate was obliged, it was tradition, to release to them at this feast one prisoner. And they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release for us Barabbas." And Luke tells us in verse 19, Barabbas was one who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city and for murder. So Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept on saying, "Crucify, crucify him." And he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has this man done? I have found in him no guilt demanding death. Therefore I will punish him and release him." Now something that Luke does not tell us, but one of the other writers tells us about, I believe it's Matthew, talks about that Pilate's wife had actually had a dream the night before. And in this dream, she had dreamed about what was taking place. And something about the dream, we don't have the details, but she had sent word to Pilate, her husband, "Have nothing to do with this man. He is innocent. If you touch him, something bad will happen to you." And so what Pilate does, we're going to go on reading here. What evil, but they were insistent. Verse 23, they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. And Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand be granted. But he did it in this way. Again, one of the other gospel writers tells us this. He actually brings out a basin of water and washes his hands in front of them and says, "I wash my hands of this matter. His blood be upon you." And they literally, the Jews who were there literally said, "His blood be upon us." Oh my. The guilt for his death be upon us, in other words. But Pilate pronounced the sentence, and their demand was granted, and he released the man, Jesus, that they were asking, he released the man, Barabbas, that they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder. But he delivered Jesus to their will. All this happened starting sometime late in the night. It was concluded early in the morning. They'd went home and rested. They'd gathered together early in the morning. And now all that has happened, coming to Pilate, then going to Herod, then coming back to Pilate, all within just a short amount of an hour, hour and a half perhaps, all early in the morning, probably started around 6 a.m. The Jews began their day at sunrise, about 6 a.m., and they'd begun to do all this. And you'll understand why I say that's the time period here in just a moment. But we're going to move from the trials now. Jesus has been accused. He's been found guilty. not by a real court, but by these kangaroo courts. And the Jews are now going to have their way, and so he's delivered to them for crucifixion. The crucifixion actually begins in Pilate's courtyard, which is called the Praetorium. It is the area where the army would have gathered. Matthew chapter 27 tells us this. Then the soldiers of the governor of Pilate took Jesus into the Praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. I did some research and found out, I was astonished, I did not know this, a Roman cohort was anywhere from 400 to 600 men. Now, whether all of them were there watching, or maybe that was in the compound, they may have been housed around the walls of this Praetorium in housing in the walls. We're not really sure exactly. But he gathers the soldiers. Verse 28, they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. A scarlet robe. I wonder where that robe came from. I believe that's the robe that Herod had supplied and had been continuing to follow him in this journey. Verse 29, after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head, and a reed, a stick, a light stick in his right hand, and they knelt down before him. They put that in his hand as though it was a scepter, and a royal robe on his back, and a crown of thorns upon his head. And they began to say, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They were mocking him. They were making fun of Jesus as the King of the Jews, as if that was anything. They spat on him, and they took the reed, and they began to beat him on the head. You can imagine every time he gets hit in the head with that reed, the crown of thorns is poking and jabbing into his forehead. And after they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off him and put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him. Now, this is a very abbreviated version. There's much more detail in the other Gospels. Verse 32, and as they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, who they pressed into service to bear his cross. So here the Roman guard has their way in torturing Jesus in a very cruel way. He'd already been beaten the night before in the face. It said that the Jewish men had hit him in the face with their fists. They'd slapped him in the wee hours of the night. Herod's soldiers had made a mockery of Jesus, dressed him in the gorgeous robe, and now the Roman cohort, perhaps several hundred soldiers, begin the real punishment. And part of that punishment was scourging. Scourging. First of all, Jesus would have been tied to a post, whether it was a post standing or it could have been a post where he was bent over so that his back would have been stretched tight. And then two men would have used a whip called a flagum. You can see pictured here. It was a short whip, not a big long bull whip like we think of. It would have been a very short whip, a wooden handle, and it would have had several thongs of leather coming out. And in each of those thongs of leather would have been tied pieces of bone or pieces of metal, just little shards of metal, whatever it may be. And two men would stand, one on each side, whipping Jesus, one on this side, one on that side, so that they could be sure and cover him completely with the whips. Now, Jewish law would have required that they only give 39 lashes, but now he was in Roman hands and there was no limit. We don't know how many times that he was lashed, how many times he was whipped. But scourging was so horrendous, so horrible, that many times those who had been scourged died before they even went any farther. This is a picture taken from the movie The Passion of the Christ. So this is Mel Gibson and Hollywood's rendition of what Jesus may have looked at. And you can see the low post there that he had been stretched over. The torture was so horrible that flesh and even muscle were stripped away from their bodies. In fact, Josephus says in his account of these scourgings that many times arteries, veins, bones, and even organs were left exposed because of the amount of flesh that was torn away by the flagum. And then after the scourging, Jesus had this gorgeous robe placed upon him. And that picture, I don't know. I wasn't there. How accurate, maybe it was worse than that, or maybe it wasn't that bad. But you can just imagine how Jesus looked and felt in that situation. The Roman soldier is holding up what would be later nailed to the cross above Jesus' head that says, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. That was his crime, and that's what he was crucified for. So after he is scourged, he has this gorgeous robe placed over his flayed shoulders and back, the crown of thorns pressed upon his head. They had mocked him as King of the Jews. They had spat upon him in derision. They beat him over his head with his reed, his royal scepter. Then they stripped him, placed his own garments back upon him after this, and they laid the cross upon his open wounds, upon his back and his shoulders, and began to march him off to the place of crucifixion. As Jesus begins the journey, he's unable to carry the cross because of, no doubt, physical weakness after all of this. The long night, the horrible torture, emotional weariness from the weight of sin, our sin, my sin, bearing down upon him. And he cannot carry the cross. He cannot go on. And so they grab this bystander, this Simon who was from Cyrene, and he carries the cross to Calvary, to Golgotha, for Jesus. And so that is where we go next, to Golgotha. And there are many verses from the scriptures that describe what took place. Number one, he was crucified between two thieves, two robbers. He was in the middle, Jesus. The soldiers, when Jesus was there, he was stripped down to his very, very minimal there. And the soldiers divided up his garments and gambled for them, shooting dice of some sort, who knows what, gambling over his clothes. The Roman charge, the condemnation, King of the Jews, was placed above his head. The Bible tells us that those who came by mocked him and ridiculed him. Let me read a few verses here too. It says, those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads and saying, you who were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from that cross. In the same way, the chief priests and the scribes were mocking him, saying, he saved others, but he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross and we'll believe in him. He trusts in God. Well, let God rescue him now if he delights in him. For he has said that he is the Son of God. So they're just throwing the abuse, throwing the words at him. Even one of the robbers, one of those crucified beside him, begins to say things saying, are you the Christ? Well, go ahead, save yourself. And while you're at it, save us. And the other thief on the other side begins to scold him and says, what are you doing? Don't you fear God? You're under the same sentence of condemnation. You're about to die. Aren't you afraid of where you're going? Are we in need of, we are indeed suffering justly, he said. We're receiving what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And then he said to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. This other robber had no doubt seen Jesus out in the streets healing the sick and opening blind eyes. He had heard the ministry. He had probably begun to have faith in Jesus, but now because of his crimes he's about to die. But there's obviously a faith in Jesus for who he was, because he says to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I'm sorry I have sinned. I'm sorry I've done wrong. His faith was in Jesus, and Jesus said to him, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Even on the cross, Jesus is extending love and kindness. Matthew and Luke tell us, Mark first tells us that Jesus was crucified about 9 a.m. So all these trials, all this has happened through the night, early in the morning, and at 9 a.m. about Jesus is crucified upon the cross. Matthew and Luke tell us that at noon,